Join your hosts, David Poole and Aaron Barnhill, as they pile up information and break it down so that you can be more successful in the garden. Hey guys, welcome back to the Compost Pile, your source for all things gardening, homesteading, and more. Today I've got a special guest, Mr. Paul Lemoine, and we're going to talk about his transition from working with raised beds. He's moving to raised beds, away from a lot of in-ground gardening with tractor work and such. And we're going to talk a lot about advantages of growing in the ground versus advantages of growing in a raised bed, so that you can kind of get a feel for what might work best for you and what crops might not be suited for raised beds. So let's dive in. So last time I talked to you, you brought up that you were kind of transitioning to raised beds for a lot of your stuff, and that kind of surprised me because I've always known you as growing in the ground, like big areas, lots of plants. What made you decide to do that?
Well, several reasons. One, the major reason was it got me thinking more about raised bed versus, plowing was drainage. I had a couple years in a row where I had beautiful tomato plants and crops ready to pick, get a large deluge of rain, and I couldn't get the water out. And it saturated, and I lost a lot of my main crops. And at the same time, I had one or two raised beds that I was growing things in that they survived. And so the light bulb went off my head. I was working 10 times harder to try to keep the in-ground plants going, and I was doing better with a few plants in a raised bed.
So you kind of saw that you're eliminating one elemental variable that you can't control, and that's kind of drainage. And to me, that's always been a big thing for a push for people growing in raised beds, especially as we see, like, to me, compared to when I was a kid, I remember lots of rain, but I mean, just the amount that we get at one time, like today is a great example.
Yep.
It rained. It didn't seem like it rained that much, but then on my drive home, the ditches are full. There's water all in my garden area back here behind the office.
Yep.
And it takes forever to drain out just because the natural soil consistency being primarily clay.
Right.
And I think maybe, we're about to be in potato planting season, and it is pretty common to get some heavy rains that time of year, and that could be a huge disadvantage where you might lose your entire crop due to rotting just because you can't get the water out. So,
or you can't even work the ground.
Yeah.
It's so wet. There's been years where I've had to delay the planting by 1 or 2 weeks because I just physically couldn't get out there.
And that can be huge. That could be the difference between getting an actual harvest out of some things and not. Yep. Even like on tomatoes, you get delayed 1 to 2 weeks, and then you're out there fighting insects that you might not have had an issue with or have been as prevalent had you been able to get it in the ground earlier on.
Absolutely.
So that's one I did not think about, was just like timing and being able to get out there and work the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So, and whenever you were doing a lot of in-ground gardening, I imagine there's a lot more labor going into the actual prep work. Because you've got to, in-ground gardening typically always, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is tilling.
Right.
Having to work the ground, make sure that it's staying loose, and that you have, workable soil that's not clumped up. How much ground prep did you normally have to do when you were doing that?
Yeah, so yes to everything you said, and I do have a little bit of advantage where I'm at in Port Neches. I have a lot of looser sandy loam. I don't deal with the clay gumbo like I had in some of my other gardens. So that's a bonus there. But when you have more of a sandy loam, I deal more with nutsedge and stuff. But aside from that fact, there's still a lot more prep you got to do to get large areas of garden either tilled with by a hand tiller or a tractor or something like that. And the first thing that happens when you do that, and you start tilling, the prior year's garden or even new ground, you're going to have to deal with a lot of. You're going to have to get the grass out or the weeds. You got to have a way to suppress that. And as soon as you start tilling, you're planting weeds. Because lots of weeds.
Because even something simple as nutsedge, it could lay dormant in the soil for I believe I read one time it could lay dormant for up to 10 years. And then you basically you disturb the soil, the conditions become right, and then these seeds germinate, and then you have a whole problem that wasn't there before.
Absolutely, and you upset the microbial action in your soil, and so you have that, and then you have to leave yourself walkways in open ground so you can access your plants. And of course,
Right.
you're typically rowing, or you may be doing some block planting in some kind of raised areas of soil, but typically you still got to leave yourself walkways, and you were spending an inordinate amount of time trying to keep your walkways semi weed free, so it doesn't encroach into your rows, and you still got to do your weeding around your plants. So now you're spending probably at least 50 to 60% more time just keeping your walkways clear and not even tending to your your rows where your plants are.
Yeah,
And
that
so
definitely
you
makes
lose
sense.
a lot of time.
And if you have weeds and such growing in the walkways, then they're definitely more likely to make their way up into the rows, and then you're going to have a lot more resource competition for
Yeah.
nutrients, for water, really anything. What are some other things that you, as you're making this transition, that you find that you like more about growing in raised beds?
Well, okay, number one, you're not disturbing the soil near as much, so it seems like you have a better microbial action in your soil, and you're not having to do heavy amendments. You're not having to doing tilling or broad forking or whatever, and labor wise, it's 75% less at least, if not more. It's easy to keep the weeds in check. Um, it's above the ground at a level, depending on what size raised bed you have. That they tend to warm quicker
True, yeah.
in the spring or the late winter, and so and typically you don't put your soil completely level with the top, so you have some side protection of some of the cooler,
Yeah,
late winter, early spring winds, which is great for your early planters. Like if you're planting your tomatoes early, you get some type of wind protection in there, and so. I mean, there's so many more advantages, and just not having to in till ground. I'm on my knees.
yeah.
I'm crawling around there on all fours at times, getting the stuff. Well, on the raised beds I built, I actually have a 2x6 perimeter on every one of them, and then you can sit on them, and it's nice and comfortable.
Makes it easy.
Yeah, you can reach over to both sides, or you can sit around both sides, and you can have your coffee there and all that kind of stuff, and you're not laying in the ants and
I
everything
feel
else.
like as we move, we're getting ready for the spring season too. Like, you're saying there's so much more prep work in getting a row garden ready. But for me, like the preparation process for spring or any season, no matter what I'm doing, is so simple because if I'm starting off with quality components and I'm being mindful about what I'm putting into my beds, a lot of times my beds and my soil is nice and loose. I'm not having to do much of anything. I might be top dressing with some compost. That's to me that's one of the disadvantages I do find in raised beds is really there is more ongoing cost from a perspective of having to provide more inputs. If you don't have your own compost pile,
Yeah.
material soils, they break down into finer and smaller particles over time, and then you get that settling in the beds, and you're always having to potentially add a little bit more to keep that volume up. I know, like at home, if I don't do anything after 1 year, my beds will be 8 inches down, and I've got to add some material back in there depending on what I'm growing, to keep it where I've got a fair
Level,
volume,
right.
comfortable
Right.
level, and that's that to me that it is a little bit of a con to raised beds. But whenever I think about, like, to me the cost of having to provide a little bit more soil or nutrients in there is far better than the labor.
Well, you're right on all those aspects because I've had to do the same to my raised beds. But, and you may not know this, you have to do the same in your teal garden because that's where you run into your drainage problems. Because now I have a maybe a 60 foot by 100 foot area that I plow out. Well, it's like a bowl now.
That
You
does
still
make
have to add.
that does make sense because
Yeah.
I actually had a longtime customer called our landscape company last week, and he wanted to cut his garden in half,
Yeah.
and we ended up having to bring in, I think, close to 6 yards of just 60-40 light to smooth it out so he could put grass over it. And that was after getting everything else taken care of. When he'd had that hill garden, it just broke down and it was low. And so that does make sense.
So yeah, you're losing the same amount spread out over a larger area.
Yeah.
But another thing that happens, you'll notice, it's kind of like the back of a baseball field, on the back of the green. And every time they get to dragging it, well, you end up making a little dike all around it. So I can see in my garden now where it's got a little raised area, because when you go to tilling, it's throwing dirt out in that grass,
Right.
and you're trying to get it back in there, but you don't always do it. So you end up with a berm around there, and then that first big rain comes. I'm having to get out there and dig trenches
to get it
to
out.
get it out of there, because everything else had dropped down lower. And, you think you're adding compost and all that, you are, but now you got to add it over such a larger area. I would rather add into my raised beds like I've been doing this week.
Yeah, I think it's and that proves the point. Like water, too much water is such an issue for growing a lot of things. So you definitely got to make sure when you're putting these raised beds in that you either if you either mix a good soil consistency and something that has got great drainage to it, or good drainage amendments,
Yep.
or or mix yourself something, or buy something of high quality.
Right.
That to me is is a barrier to entry in gardening and raised beds, because it can get incredibly expensive. If you're not someone who can get out there and build your own beds and cut some cost by using your time to do it, if you've got to go out there and buy a kit or buy something out there and fill it, it gets expensive fast.
It does.
And I always recommend people having more than one bed, if at all possible.
Sure.
So you have the ability to rotate around to the best of your ability some of your stuff. But it's not always economical to be able to put two beds in, depending on the size and space. I'm lucky enough to have a lot of space. I've got 7 beds, and they're all different sizes, but that's not an option for every backyard or every home.
No, and another nice thing about the raised beds is you can incorporate those even on the balcony of an apartment. You can get a small kit raised bed and grow at least some herbs and a few vegetables there. And you can get different shapes and sizes if you're handy. Like I am, you can build your own. I've built them from, cinder blocks on up to, now I'm using some used corrugated roofing material.
Yep, that's
that I rip down the middle, so that gives me a 17-inch size, which is for this tall.
That's how we built the ones when we did the Victory Garden
Yeah.
a long time ago. And
right.
Those lasted, I think, almost 10 years before they started to deteriorate. Like the wood finally was like, but I mean, that's a great, I've built some for some clients like that before, and I think that's a good DIY option, because it does hold up.
Yeah, you can find, especially on used roofing tin, which is a heavier gauge than, we started out with that light corrugated over there.
Yeah.
This roofing tin, this stuff may last you 20 years, It's a lot heavier duty. And then I attach it to scrap 4x4 pieces, and that's where I can lay a 2x6 rail all the way around it, and that's what you can sit on, and then it's sturdy.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, it's great. Easy to do.
Yeah. So other than like cost, drainage, prep, is there any crops that you still foresee yourself only being able to grow in a row garden that just don't work out well enough to waste your time in a raised bed?
Well, I would say something like, and you can grow these in raised beds. So what I'm gonna tell you is, it's not that you can't do it, but you're gonna use your whole bed for one crop. And like most gardeners, you like to have a variety of things. So
Right.
anytime you grow some, and so cantaloupes is one that you can do in raised beds, because you can trellis cantaloupes and hang them in pantyhose and all that kind of good stuff. When you start doing watermelons, if you'd like to do watermelons on your larger varieties, one vine is going to fill up this room and that room, and so that takes a huge amount of space. Sweet potatoes can That's another one.
The giving field is always a great example. They plant those
Yes.
several beds, and I mean that's all that's in there, and it's
That's it.
everywhere.
So you just got to keep that in mind. What is your goals? If you want to have more of a variety like I do, I mean, I love spring planting, but my favorite gardens are my fall gardens, and
Yeah.
so I like a variety of things, and you can grow them, and like I said, you can grow anything in raised beds. You can grow sweet corn in raised beds.
That's one I remember you talking about before.
Yeah.
But sweet corn is one I feel like if I put it in a small raised bed, I'm pretty to get enough to make it worth my while.
That's it.
Which may still not even be enough. It's going to be that whole
Yeah.
bed.
It's gonna be, you got to have a big bed, or you got to have several beds, and as you know, you need to grow them in a block, for the
For
proper
pollination.
And of course, the old timers, which I guess I'm an old timer, but the old timers, they like to plant peas with their corn and use the stalks as
So trellis.
As
Yeah.
trellises, and so that's another good way you can plant corn in a raised bed and incorporate some of your climbing peas.
Yeah, and once those crops are done too, if you just chop them, then you're going to get some of your nitrogen back into the
Oh, you
soil
bet.
from those
Yeah.
peas. Corn being a heavier nitrogen feeder, that's always a good combination.
Right, and the peas being a nitrogen fixer. So corn is a very heavy nitrogen fixer.
Yeah, you got to feed
Yes.
it a lot.
You
So,
bet.
well, what whenever you plant your raised beds as you're moving into this, do you typically plant your things in like blocks of single crops, or do you intercrop like multiple things together? I'm asking this out of curiosity.
Yeah, yeah.
'Cause I do things myself oftentimes different than most people. I like to plant my stuff. I'll have like a couple tomatoes, and I'll have it surrounded with flowers and herbs, and it'll be an eclectic look. But my pollination and a lot of my diversity in my garden, as far as insects and actual wildlife and such, is so much greater since I started doing it this way. But that doesn't make it the most successful way. I probably could get more production if I planted in groupings, but I'm just curious what your method.
Yeah, I do both. Sometimes I will isolate certain varieties, and I'll give you, for instance, right now in one of my older raised beds, and 4 of my raised beds are 5 foot wide, 20 foot long, and that's because that's how long the tin was.
Okay.
And that's the only reason why I picked that, because that's what I had. But anyhow, so in a third of that 1 5 by 20, I have my asparagus. As you know, asparagus, that's something that takes 2 years before
Right.
you start doing a harvest. Well, these are 3 and 4 years old, and so that portion of that raised bed, that's
Is dedicated to that.
dedicated for asparagus. But even last year, I was able to plant some pickling cucumbers on one end, on the side of that block of asparagus, and even right on the other end, and even in between, before they burned out real bad, I had some was it beets I had in there planted, and so I planted things kind of amongst them a little bit, and then I had the other 2/3 that I planted some tomatoes, and then I have strawberries in the far end.
Okay.
So I got asparagus this end, strawberries, and then some veggies here, and a little bit on the end. So yeah, I'm able to move it around, and so I experimented with that, and it actually did really well. And then on one of my other beds, I had it kind of like you did. I just kind of had it interspersed with different things. I planted a few peas here or whatever, and some broccoli over here, and
Yeah.
I had it all kind of scattered around in there. And so I like the variety too. I'm in a row garden, typically you're doing like 60-foot row of beans and 6-foot row of squash.
Right, yeah.
And you kind of have it all grouped up like that, and that made for ease of harvesting and maintaining and stuff. But in raised beds, you can do it how you want.
That's kind of one of the cool things. I have a lot of herbs and things that are like mainstays that are there
Yeah.
year after year after year, and I don't start over. So I'm always working kind of around some of those items. But one of my favorite things that I find is one of the best advantages of growing in a raised bed, I can use all the flat surface in my beds, and there's almost always something in spring or even during the summer that I can grow right on the edge.
Yep.
Like my peas, my green beans, I'll grow them, and I'll let them hang over the edges so that I still have all this open space in the middle, and then I'm getting that extra production just out of the edge. We did that with our green beans last year, and I
Right.
mean that was the best production I had, and it took no space. And I thought that was I'd never done the green beans that way. I'd done
Right.
a lot of herbs and a lot of other things, but bordering those was probably one of my best choices.
Yeah, because it's almost like you're adding size to your raised bed by letting that stuff overhang. So you're just using a small portion of
Yeah.
your soil inside for the rooting and all that kind of stuff, and then however you're watering it,
Right.
typically with me it's drip irrigation that I
And
install.
if you were doing, you couldn't do that same thing in a row garden. If you planted something on the side, it's going to be in your walking rows. You're going to be stepping on it. So
Absolutely.
that's a pretty unique advantage,
Yeah.
I think, to
And if they're ugly on the outside, it kind of covers it up a little bit.
yeah, for sure. So one last thing that I wanted to ask you before we wrap up this episode today. Random question, but give me your top 3 things that you like to grow for the upcoming spring season.
That's easy. My favorite, top one of all time is Brandywine tomatoes.
Okay.
Okay, heirloom, best tasting tomato on the planet according to all kind of studies. That's number one, and because it's hard to get production here, and about 1 out of every 3 years I have a good crop of it.
Okay.
That's number one, and then so even though sometimes they're troublesome, my next two when I go to planting stuff is tomatoes, and I love squashes and zucchinis.
Okay.
So you can group those together in my twos, and then I'm going to plant some type of peas, and typically it's going to be the number one is going to be snap beans, green beans. But I'm
That's one of
always
my
going to have
favorite.
But I love growing purple hulls and different kinds, the Mississippi Peak Highs and your quick picks or whatever's available. But
Yeah.
because we do a lot of canning, and
Okay.
I like eating those peas year round. So my wife cans these, so I grow extra peas.
So
and
you got
beans.
plenty to make you through the season.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah. So I can go to my pantry right now and get you green beans or peas or whatever.
Okay.
And they taste just like you picked them.
that's awesome.
So that's why I like growing extra with that, and that's another reason I still maintain an area for in-ground planting, so I can grow large amounts of it.
Something, yeah, so you can preserve it for a longer period of time.
And I got to buy an electric pea sheller about 5 years ago.
Oh,
and
nice.
and it's fun using it. Just slide them all in there.
I've always wanted to see one of those.
Oh yeah,
so
I'll have to show you this year. It's pretty cool.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So that wraps this episode up, guys. I hope you got some great information about whether maybe you should choose to grow in the ground or in a raised bed, and we'll catch you on the next episode.